Well, there's two ways this can go. One is the way, a rational way, which is that, like every other president who tried to make friends with Putin, and it didn't work, they eventually then get tough on Putin. We could be in a situation now, like we have been with every other president, where Trump says, "I guess nothing good is going to happen with Putin. I tried, and I'm not going to try any longer." Or alternatively, we could be in the situation which seems that we have been in so far, where for reasons that are inexplicable, Trump says, "I'm not going to do anything to provoke Putin. I want to be his friend," and he carries on by just sort of ignoring the atrocities that Putin continues to inflict on Ukraine.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. Today we're speaking to financier and political activist Sir Bill Browder. Bill is head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign and has been campaigning against Kremlin oppression and injustice since he was banned from Russia for exposing corruption. Bill, thank you very much for joining us again today.
Great to be here.
Well, we've heard out of the US today that supplies of Patriot missiles to Ukraine will be resumed. I just wanted to start with your thoughts on that development.
Well, it's a little more complicated than the headline. What has been agreed is that the U.S. will now sell Patriot air defense systems to European NATO allies, who can then provide those to Ukraine. So, if you remember, during the Biden administration, America provided military aid to Ukraine. Now the U.S. is selling military equipment to European allies who provide that to Ukraine. So a lot of people are jumping up and saying, Trump has changed his tune. Well, it's not exactly changing his tune. He's kind of like saying to Putin, sorry, pal, I'm going to still sell weapons to my allies, and what they do with those weapons is really not up to me. It kind of feels to me like this is not some 180-degree turn by Donald Trump, but time will tell.
Are you happy to see, though, Europe being given a level of more autonomy to provide those weapons through the US? And do you think that Europe has stepped up to a certain extent?
Well, first of all, it's what Putin has done in the last few days and few weeks is attack Ukrainian civilians with a ferociousness that has not been equaled since the start of the war. He's been just swarming Ukraine with missiles and drones and all sorts of other nastiness, and killing lots of innocent people all across Ukraine. These are not military targets. These are civilians that are being killed indiscriminately across Ukraine. And so anybody who's watching this, feels, any decent person who's watching this feels that Ukraine needs whatever help they can get to fight this off. And we're not talking about offensive weapons, we're talking about defensive weapons. And so, of course, it's monumentally important that Ukraine has everything that they could possibly have to protect themselves. And it's quite shameful that the United States stopped supplying Patriot missile batteries at this exact moment in time when Ukraine was being bombarded by Vladimir Putin. It's even more shameful that this was done in the context of President Trump trying to end this war in 24 hours. And so it up until now, it looked like he was basically letting Ukraine hang out to dry. And so his idea that Europe could step in, buy the weapons, and supply them to Ukraine is at least some respite for the Ukrainians. But it still leaves open this very ugly question, which is why did the U.S. stop the military aid? Why did they stop the defensive weapons from being supplied? And surely the Europeans stepping in is a step forward. There is one other angle to this whole thing, which is worth noting, though, which is the Germans have said that they won't supply offensive weapons, or specifically they won't supply Taurus long-range missiles. So the Germans are saying defensive weapons are okay, but offensive weapons are not okay, when offensive weapons are what's needed right now, because if you're sort of a sitting duck, if you're a country the size of Ukraine and Putin is lobbying in 500 or 750 projectiles a day, what the Ukrainians need to do and what they have to do is find out where that stuff is coming from and destroy it before it's ever launched. And that's what offensive weapons would do.
And how would you judge Ukraine's ability to not only resist the strikes that we have seen, but to strike back on some of those Russian targets? And what do you think it says about Ukraine's capability to withstand these strikes?
Well, Ukraine has done a remarkable job for a country which has literally 90% less resources than Russia in terms of equipment and soldiers and so on, for them to be able to fend off Russia. And the number of Russian soldiers that they're killing who are trying to every day invade their country and take more territory is nothing short of miraculous. But Ukraine is a huge country in this, and there's so many places to defend, and so it's just literally physically impossible for them to defend everything. And so it's one thing to try to defend, it's another thing to attack. And of course, the Ukrainians have done a great job of taking out a third of the long-range bombers in this sort of to be a movie to be made about Operation Spiderweb, where they basically came in with drones, drove them up to the military bases, and then let them out of the trucks to destroy a third of their long-range bombers. But there's still a lot of stuff to destroy if Ukraine is going to stop Russia. And Ukraine has the ability to do this. If you remember, Ukraine doesn't have a navy. Russia has the Black Sea Fleet, but Ukraine, through ingenious mobile or Navy drones, has basically made it impossible for Russia's Navy to do anything to Ukraine. They're all shuddering and parked in a faraway place and not operational because the Ukrainians have effectively dominated the sea without even having their own Navy. And so the Ukrainians, when it comes to self-defense, are doing an unbelievable job, but it's still, they're up against a country which has effectively unlimited resources and are just lobbing in everything that they've got all day long, every day, which, by the way, is what the Russians do anytime they go after a target. They did this in Chechnya, they did this in Georgia, they did this in Syria, and now they're doing this in Ukraine.
And it's currently early afternoon here in the UK, quite early in the morning in the east coast of the US. We're expecting a possible announcement today on those ongoing, being built up third-party sanctions on Russian oil. Do you think these sanctions could make a difference? Because they are considerably broader, especially targeting India and China, if they do come to fruition, than previous sanctions. Do you think they can make a difference?
Well, it all depends on what the sanctions are. So there's a piece of legislation sponsored by Lindsey Graham, one of Trump's allies, which has, I believe, something like 84 co-sponsors. Out of 100 senators, 84 senators have co-sponsored it. So it's obviously going to pass, which says that the U.S. would impose 500% tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil. And so guess what? Nobody's going to buy Russian oil if that piece of legislation goes through. But it's not clear that that's the policy that's going to be implemented. It could be that Trump has been resisting. He's been pressuring Lindsey Graham not to put it to vote. And he could propose something far less aggressive, far weaker. We don't know. And so I think we have to see what the sanctions are, what the legislation is, and how painful it is to the people who are buying Russian oil to determine whether that will make any difference or not.
And I think we've spoken before, Bill, about this kind of cycle that the US seems to have almost been stuck in since Putin has come to power, of attempting to somehow bring Russia in, tighten relations with Russia, only for the Kremlin to effectively play the West and seeing those relations again collapse. How do you judge the possible collapse at the moment of Trump's own attempt to basically side with Putin in this conflict?
Well, we don't have any evidence that he's changed his mind, his opinion. I mean, if Putin had been the Iranian leader, America would have been bombing Russia right now. I mean, so Putin is sitting there playing Trump. He's defying Trump, and Trump is either scared of Putin or Trump really wants to be friends with Putin, and he doesn't want to do anything that will sacrifice his friendship. And so as a result, we're in this situation where Trump has put up all sorts of deadlines for Putin to cease fire, and Putin just puts up nonsense in response, and Trump doesn't do anything. And so until we see Trump actually doing something, I would assume that this sort of love affair between these two heads of state remains in place.
And do you think anything has been learnt here by those who, were arguing so strongly for this idea of just bringing the war to a close somehow?
Well, the main thing that's clear to everybody is that the war is not coming to a close, that Putin has no intention of bringing this war to a close. And the more that Trump tries to placate Putin and doesn't hold his feet to the fire, the more Putin believes that he can achieve all of his maximalist objectives. And as long as that's the case, the war is definitely not going to come to the end. The only thing that's going to make this war come to an end is if Putin has no choice but to bring the war to the end, because his other option would be worse. But he's not in that situation right now. We've not done anything to put him in that situation. And so the war will carry on.
And what will the Kremlin make of this, though, if Putin fails to keep Trump out of the war in Ukraine? I mean, if he just keeps pushing further and further as this language out of the US intensifies on the Russians not making any progress in any sort of talks or any attempt to build peace?
Well, there's two ways this can go. One is the way, a rational way, which is that, like every other president who tried to make friends with Putin and it didn't work, they eventually then get tough on Putin. And this happened with George Bush. George Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. And then it didn't work out so well after that. And there was a very terrible relationship between the United States and Russia. Then Barack Obama came in and he came up with the idea of the Russian reset. And the Russian reset was supposed to be resetting or effectively appeasing Russia in hopes that everything could go smoothly. That relationship broke down. And then you had Trump coming in first time around and wanting to be friends with Putin. Nothing good happened there. And then, of course, all this stuff that happened under Biden. And so we could be in a situation now, like we have been with every other president, where Trump says, I guess nothing good is going to happen with Putin. I tried, and I'm not going to try any longer. Or alternatively, we could be in the situation which seems that we have been in so far, where for reasons that are inexplicable, Trump says, I'm not going to do anything to provoke Putin. I want to be his friend. And he carries on by just sort of ignoring the atrocities that Putin continues to inflict on Ukraine. And from my perspective, until I see Trump doing something, not talking, but doing something that harms Putin, I think that the most likely scenario is the scenario of status quo, that Trump is going to carry on just being friends with Putin.
And there is an 18th round of European sanctions in the works at the moment. Do you think they're doing enough, or is there room here with the US taking a possibly harsher stance to do something more dramatic at the moment? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of doing more with those seized Russian assets that are still held in Europe.
Well, the main thing, which would completely change the outcome of this war, would be for the European Union, the UK, and various other countries to confiscate $300 billion of frozen Russian central bank reserves. If that money is confiscated and used to fund Ukraine's defense, then all of a sudden, Ukraine could afford to buy all the most advanced weapon systems. And then they could use those weapon systems to attack Russia in places where their military are forming, in places where they're manufacturing equipment, in places where they're refining oil and selling that oil for hard currency. And if that were to happen, this could change the outcome of the war. So far, the Europeans are just dancing around the head of a pin, talking about, in theory, is this good for the rule of law? And in the meantime, Ukraine is getting pulverized. And if this carries on for a long time, Ukraine might eventually lose the war. And if that's the case, then Europe will be literally on the front line itself, having to fight Russia because of Putin's desires to take various EU countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and possibly Poland.
And how much confidence do you have in sanctions and economic pressure alone to stop the Kremlin? I mean, how much pain do you think Putin's willing to put on the Russian people for his war? And how much do you think the Russian people can withstand?
Well, the Russian people haven't even begun to feel economic pain that could be felt. And the main way to impose a real economic disaster on Russia would be to effectively embargo their sale of oil. If Russia can't sell oil, um, they're out of business. That's all they have. And nobody's wanted to touch oil because everybody's worried about the oil price. But at the same time, people are buying Russian oil and then funding Ukraine to fight back against Russia, where Russia is using the proceeds from that oil to fight Ukraine. And so something's got to give somewhere. And the best way, if we really wanted to stop Russia, would be to basically bankrupt them. And the best way to bankrupt them would be to completely get in the way of their sale of oil to the West and get in the way of their flowing of getting flows of hard currency to fund their war.
And meanwhile, in Moscow itself, last week we saw some turmoil among the political class in Russia. A Russian energy minister was found shot dead, reportedly by himself after having been fired by Putin. Alongside this, an oil CEO has also died after falling out of a window on an apartment block. In addition to that, there's been a gold tycoon who was arrested while trying to flee Russia, seemingly on his private jet. I mean, what does this say about the way Putin's Russia operates in general, but also under these wartime conditions?
Well, all these stories are unique in their own situations, but what they tell you on a broader basis is that the money flow into Russia has been reduced dramatically. As a result, there are people fighting over the remaining money flow, and those people are killing each other over the remaining money flow. And now each of these situations that you described probably has a different story, and maybe some of them are as they seem. Maybe that was a suicide for the transport minister. Probably not. But most likely, what you have here is just fighting over the scraps of a declining economy, and this is what they do. They kill each other over money, and they put each other in jail over money, and it's all one big extortion operation where the people who are doing the extorting are the ones who can arrest people and the ones who can kill people.
And as you've discussed today, Bill, and I think this fits into this discussion we've just had there, there's been a lot of leeway given to Russia in this conflict since Trump came into power in the US. And yet there doesn't seem to have been a major military victory yet for Russia as a result of that. They did manage to take back that land in Kursk, but that was largely been Russian territory that they've retaken. Do you think, given the leeway that the Trump administration has given Putin, he's managed to achieve as much as he would have liked?
No, I think that this war could be ended if Trump put his foot down. But if Trump were to withdraw from the whole thing, it doesn't mean that Ukraine loses. It just means that they lose a lot more people defending themselves. The Ukrainians have shown that invading their country is not an easy task. Russia's losing between 1,000 and 1,500 men a day to take almost de minimis territory. It's not working out for Putin. It's working out very badly. Putin's only strength in this whole situation is that he doesn't care about 1,000 or 1,500 people a day dying. It doesn't bother him. In any normal country, after 10 days of that, the head of state would lose his position. But in Russia, Putin doesn't lose his position because he's an absolute dictator, and therefore it doesn't matter what people think about him. But they're not making progress. They're not winning the war. They're just losing a lot of people, losing a lot of money, losing a lot of equipment in an effort which, if you were to extrapolate the progress they're making, it would take them 100 years to take over all of Ukraine. And if you were to take one big step back and look at Russia on a map, and I urge people to do this, look at Russia on a map and then look at this tiny sliver of land that they're fighting over right now. It's not about territory. Putin just wants to be at war because they have got so much territory, they don't know what to do with their territory. This makes no sense geographically, and it makes no sense strategically to lose so much for this little sliver of land that they're fighting over.
And you talked about the support for Crimea. Sorry, let me just retake that. And we talked about the support for Ukraine outside of the US. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, and Boris Pistorius, Germany's Minister of Defense, will also be in Washington this week to meet Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defense. We've talked a bit about the Germans today, but what do you make of Mark Rutte's role in keeping the Americans on side with NATO and trying to manage the alliance in what's been quite a difficult time?
Well, he's done a very good job. He's been very complimentary towards Trump. He's run around all the major European NATO capitals and demanded 5% of GDP in the form of defense. And he's got everybody committing to that, and people are increasing their defense budgets. And so Mark Rutte has done a great job. Trump said people aren't paying for their fair share. Well, now they are. So Trump can't exactly be disrespectful to Mark Rutte, and Rutte's got to get something in return, and hopefully that is America's continued engagement in NATO. Now, Trump has made lots of statements that he doesn't like NATO. He wouldn't necessarily defend NATO allies in certain situations, and so it's really a very tenuous situation where Trump stands vis-a-vis NATO. And I think what Mark Rutte and all the other NATO allies are hoping is that we can just live through this 4 years of Trump, not have him do anything drastic, and then have America come back to where it was before. Because if Trump were to say, I withdraw from NATO, that would be a hard thing to recreate afterwards.
And given this sort of coming together and solidifying of the NATO alliance, that's presumably the last thing that the Kremlin really wanted as an outcome of this, even though they may have got a lot of leeway elsewhere.
Well, Putin has accomplished effectively nothing. In addition to not getting territory, he's got NATO budgets going up dramatically. The Germans are now spending $1 trillion on their defense. Finland and Sweden have joined NATO since this whole thing started, and they're both very capable countries right on the border of Russia. And so if you look at this from any perspective, how has this helped Putin? It has, it's cost him an enormous amount of money in terms of frozen assets, potentially confiscated frozen assets, in terms of defense spending, in terms of lost equipment, in terms of an amazing, unbelievable human cost of more than 1 million young men, in terms of another 1 million men who have left the country because they don't want to serve in the military. And he's achieved nothing in spite of this cost. And the only thing that he's achieved, though, is that he's still in power. And I believe that the only reason why he's doing this war is as a way of staying in power, to create a foreign enemy so the Russians aren't mad at him. And so he's ready to sacrifice everything in order to stay in power. Why does he care so much about staying in power? Because he understands that if he's not in power, he goes to jail, his money gets taken away, and he probably dies. And so for Putin, that's the reason why he's at war. And it's a little scared man who's ready to sacrifice everything in his country for the sake of his own life.
Well, Bill Browder, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.